I want to talk to you about one of the towering figures of our nation, really, of our people. Someone that I briefly mentioned in Torah Reflections this week. But someone who really, we need to spend a little more time with him. Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. One of the great of our people, one of the greats of our nation, one of the greats of our rabbis, lived in the 2nd century. Lived in the 2nd century in the land of Israel, which at the time was, for us, the kingdom of Judah. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was of that generation of rabbis at that time who contributed in the writing of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first of 2 volumes, if you'd like, that together make the Talmud. The Mishnah was compiled over 200 years between the year 0 and the year 200, more, give or take a decade. And it was a compiling of conversations that the rabbis of the time were having. Being a rabbi was something new, actually, at the time. It was born around that time. And it was written in Hebrew, and he gave birth, after the year 200, to another 400 years of more rabbinic dialogues, commentaries on the Mishnah itself, but this time in Aramaic. When the Mishnah was written primarily in the land of Israel, the rest of the Talmud, the Gemara, the 400 years that followed, were primarily written in Babylon. And there, the lingua franca of the time was Aramaic. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was among the greatest authors, contributors to the Mishnah, so much so that we kind of, if we want to rank them, all the rabbis, he was probably like the 4th most influential rabbi, not just of the Mishnah, but of the entire Talmud. And we know that because he's one of the rabbis that is the most quoted over that period of 600 years. So much so that, in fact, he loses his last name in the Talmud and is only referred to as Rabbi Shimon. Because if you say Rabbi Shimon, everybody knows which Shimon you're talking about. That's to tell you how popular that character was. And he was popular not because he was one of the wisest of the rabbis of the time, he was also a great mystic. And I'll get to that in a moment. The rabbis who lived at the time in the generation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai witnessed one of the greatest, if not the greatest, disaster of our people. The ruthless, horrible rule of the Roman Empire. I can't even start to tell you how horrific the Romans were to our people. All in all, by the time the Roman left, 2/3 of the Jewish people had been murdered, more than any other nation coming against us in the entire history of the Jewish people. We almost really were on the brink of going extinct. Those who didn't perish at the hand of the Romans in Israel, in the kingdom of Judah, were exiled, as we know, and dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. And a few remnants were stayed in Israel in the generation of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but eventually very, very few Jews actually remained, mostly in the holy sites of Jerusalem, there always was a Jewish presence there. In Tzfat, in Safed in the north, and other little villages, Bnei Brak, and some of the famous places where there were yeshivas, where there were learning centers, and they were allowed to stay for so many generations and so many centuries. There had been a huge Jewish community in Babylon for a long time, since the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the first temple, and that remained and became actually the most important center of Jewish life in the world, before it moved to Spain, and then to Poland, and eventually to the US, and now back into Israel. So to live in that era was to witness the disaster that accompanied the rule of Rome. Not only the murder of our people, the exile of our people, but also maybe as a twist in history, the Roman thought that they would completely exterminate the Jewish people, and they even renamed the land. They renamed the land Palestine, kind of as a knife in our back, because it was named after the first nation that sought to destroy us 1,000 years before, the Philistine themselves, who King Saul and obviously David defeated. The famous David and Goliath is the story or the myth that exemplified the battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a rebel. He was one of the most vocal, fiercely opposed to the rule of Rome, and that got him into a lot of troubles. The story goes that at some point, after having voiced his criticism once too many times and rousing too many people around, he became wanted by the authorities of the empire and had to go into hiding to save his life. He and his son actually fled and hid in a cave for 13 years. This is the only rabbis. There's a lot of Buddhist lamas and other tradition, but we have one rabbi who will live in a cave for 13 years. He is the only one in our tradition that we know that ever did that. And, he went to this cave with his son to save his life, but he stayed for 13 years kind of waiting for the current emperor to die so that the next emperor could pardon anyone who was wanted by the former authorities. And then he could get out of the cave. The myth goes that God saw him and his son hidden in the cave, and he sustained them. God sustained them for 13 years, growing an orchard around the cave, and digging a well so that they could also have water. All those 13 years, they meditated day in and day out and studied the Torah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai became enlightened. He channeled the teachings of God for 13 years and digested them and stored them within him. These rabbis, when they relate the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there's a lot of awe around his character, because he was a figure bigger than life. He was such a wise, awakened being. And he has been revered for hundreds of years, for thousands of years actually, since then. So much so that even the book of the Zohar is the foundation of what we call Kabbalah today, is the main opus of the Kabbalistic endeavor. And even the Zohar was attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, such a towering Kabbalist, such a towering mystic he was. Sages and scholars actually know that that was not him who wrote the Zohar. That was Rabbi Moses de Leon, 1,000 years after Shimon Bar Yochai's death. And Moses de Leon used Shimon Bar Yochai as a nom de plume, as we say in French, because he knew that if he wrote and made believe that it was in fact written by Shimon Bar Yochai, his work would be more accepted in the Jewish community. And so for for a long time, people believed it was actually the work of Shimon Bar Yochai, that somehow Moses de Leon had discovered on one of his trips to Israel, or buried somewhere in Spain, whatever the story that he made up might have been. But that's to tell you how revered Shimon Bar Yochai was, that people didn't hesitate to believe that, in fact, he, from his genius and his Kabbalistic opening, could actually have written that book, the Zohar. I have to also say, before I continue, that to me, those rabbis of the Mishnah, those rabbis of the first 200 years of the Common Era, are true heroes of our people. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, imagine living in those days, living in the time that just followed, or, at the time where the second temple is destroyed, burned to the ground, and then in the decades that followed, living through the rule of the Roman Empire, and watching our people being decimated or dispersed, and having the presence of mind to save us, to save our nation, to save our people. They are the ones, those who wrote the Mishnah, they are the ones who, seeing that the way of worshiping, the way of being Jewish, that was connected to the land, not just to the land of Israel, but to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and not just to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but to the temple itself, where everything related or connected back to the temple. And that being completely destroyed, burned to the ground, they had to somehow, in order to help our people survive, reinvent Judaism altogether. And they did. Through their writing, through their conversations, taking into account the new life that Jews were now having in faraway places, removed from their land, removed from their roots, exposed to different languages, exposed to different traditions, pagan traditions, exposed to the Roman way of life, Christianity, who was rising at the time as a competition. Those rabbis had to reinvent Judaism from a temple-centered, geographically bound religion to a home-bound, Torah-centered tradition. The Judaism that we know today, that has evolved for the last 2,000 years, was born through the words of these rabbis of the Mishnah. We have no idea what Judaism looked like or was like before the destruction of the temple. Who we are today as Jews is a radical departure from that. And they were able to help our people survive by recreating, reinventing Judaism. A Judaism that could be practiced anywhere you are, that you only needed 10 people to create community, and that would be made, the Talmud, people think that the Talmud is just 600 years of rabbis writing edicts and laws and rigidity and strict practices, but in fact, it's one of the books that is the most flexible that we've ever read. Rabbis discuss at length anything they can do to make everything doable and easy for people wherever they are. They want no obstacles into the practices they are trying to create for anyone. Anyone should be able to practice them everywhere they are. And that's why there was a big conflict with the Karaites, for example, in those first 100 years, because the Karaites took a path that was much stricter. And the rabbis saw that it was not going to be sustainable. They wanted to create something that would be sustainable, that everybody could do wherever you were. They are true heroes. They saved our people. They preserved and saved our people. They transformed us into a people that could survive anywhere it went. So I just want to, include Shimon Bar Yochai in that group that really was essential, fundamental to the survival, so that we could have Shabbat tonight. Really, I mean it. And I mentioned Shimon Bar Yochai this week because we just celebrated his yahrzeit. We just celebrated the anniversary of his death. When I mean just, we did yesterday. Yesterday was Lag BaOmer, which is one of the holidays that we celebrate during the Jewish year. Lag BaOmer literally means the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. I can't tell you which day we are in yet, but yesterday was the 33rd day. And the 33rd day of the Omer, the Lag BaOmer, is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. To this day, we commemorate his yahrzeit, the day of his death. And we celebrate all over the world by creating huge bonfires and having barbecues. I know. When I lived in Israel, we used to actually make 2-story high bonfires, mostly on the beach, which was the safest place to do that. But that was the holiday. That's what you did. No, you can't roast marshmallows in a 2-story high bonfire. So that was not an American holiday. That was an Israeli holiday. Very different. There is also in Meron, which is a little town in the northern part of the Galilee, there is a pilgrimage every year because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is buried there, and 300,000 people make a pilgrimage to his tomb for Lag BaOmer. The town is overtaken by the pilgrims, and it's very joyous. Obviously, there are bonfires there too and barbecues everywhere. And it's also the day that traditionally you cut the hair of your 3-year-old son. You're not supposed to cut the hair of your son until your son turns 3, and then you have to wait until Lag BaOmer if you want to follow that tradition. And then there's a beautiful little family ritual where you cut the hair, for the first time you cut the hair of your son. And there's rejoicing and festivities. It's a huge deal in Israel. And again, it's because we want that moment to be imbued with the energies of Shimon Bar Yochai, this towering Kabbalist of the first century, of the 2nd century CE. And you may ask, what kind of a custom is that to celebrate someone's yahrzeit, which seems to be something we should do in a somber kind of way, by lighting ginormous bonfires? What kind of a tradition is that? Why bonfires? So there's another story, another myth. The myth of what happened the day of the death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. When he left his cave after 13 years, he began teaching the words that he had received. As he had become enlightened in his cave, he began to teach wherever he went, deep mystical teachings. And his first disciple, Rabbi Abba, defined himself as he's going to be his scribe. And he wrote down as much as he could of everything that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai ever said. On his death day, as Shimon Bar Yochai is on his deathbed, all of his disciples gathered into his little home. And everybody is crying, and everybody's mourning and praying, and the Rebbe is dying. There is great solemnity, a lot of tears, a lot of crying. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai begins to speak, begins to channel a voice that seems to be coming from the great beyond, and he continues, and the words that come out of his mouth are those amazing, deeply mystical teachings that he's suddenly channeling as if he's running out of time. He speaks, and Rabbi Abba grabs a piece of parchment and he's writing as fast as he could as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai keep speaking. The teachings are pouring out of his body as if there was no tomorrow. There was no tomorrow. And the more he talks, the faster Rabbi Abba is writing, and the faster Rabbi Abba is writing, the more Shimon Bar Yochai is talking and sharing. And he's running out of time. It's as if he needs to just give everything he's got before his time is up. And the universe is conspiring. The story goes that the sun stops in the sky. The sun decides not to set until Shimon Bar Yochai has finished telling all he has to say. And the tension grows and the excitement grows. There is an ecstasy in that room. People are getting out of their mind. There is so much energy in that room. The story goes that a great fire encircles the whole house of Shimon Bar Yochai. No one could come in, no one could get out. And Shimon Bar Yochai keeps talking and keeps pouring out of him every single Kabbalistic teaching that is still available within him. And Rabbi Abba is writing furiously everything he can, and suddenly, silence. In that moment, a great light, an incredible light bursts forth from Shimon Bar Yochai's body and fills the entire room. And in a burst, as in a burst of flame, his soul is carried and merges back into the light of his own being. Hence the bonfires. Because all of those stories are still Kabbalistic teachings. And the teachings are what the bonfires represent. And it's like when we light the Shabbat candles. As I often say, the Shabbat candles are a reflection on the outside of the energy burning within each of us, of the light of being shining within each of us. And so are the bonfires. So are the bonfires. Because the teaching of that story of Shimon Bar Yochai's death is still Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's last teaching in Kabbalah. A teaching that tells us it's not just he was so special, he was the only one, the one and only through which God spoke or who was animated by God's light. The teaching is always, it is in all of us. The teaching is always we are the ones burning with the light of God within ourselves. And we are the ones doing a great job hiding it from ourselves. Covering it with all of the stuff that we can, our identity, our preferences, our truth, our points of view, our anything, our stories, our history, all the ways that we're not enough, or that we are broken, that we're not holy, that we are not that light, that we cannot be, that's not possible. We are so covered up. Let's not wait. Let's not wait for us to be on our deathbed to let our light shine forth. Let us recognize the divine light that animates each of us, that animates every being, that animates everything as an expression of that one light, covered by the shape of a piece of wood, or covered by some kind of a carpet thing, or by skin. But it's just the outer garment of the inner light of being that we are.